It's a quiet city in the American Midwest, early 1970s. The streets are still asleep. Street lamps cast pale halos over damp asphalt. Only the distant hum of a furnace or a night train echoes through freight yards and silent alleys. In this half-light, a bent figure pushes a creaky metal cart, gathering discarded cardboard, broken bottles, scraps of metal, all the things others have discarded. He moves slowly, deliberately, like a man who carries more than just physical burden. His name is Leon Matthews. To most, he's just a silhouette in the night. A phantom one passes without notice. But to one boy, Ethan, age 12, he is something different. Ethan lives a few blocks away and walks to school past the same street each morning. He sees Leon's shadow emerging from darkness, methodical, steady. The sight becomes a fixture in Ethan's dawn routine. One morning, as autumn's edge chills the air and pale fog clings to corners, Ethan leaves home early. He wants to catch the sunrise. As he rounds the corner, he sees Leon struggle. A heavy sack has slipped off the cart and spilled onto damp pavement. Bottles clink, cardboard flaps open. Without thinking, Ethan rushes over. He kneels, helps gather the debris, fits pieces back into the cart. Their hands touch momentarily as he hands Leon the last piece. Leon straightens. For a heartbeat, their eyes meet. Ethan's gaze drifts downward, catching something on Leon's wrist. There, etched into skin, is a string of digits, dark and precise. A number tattooed there. In the morning light, it is both sharp and surreal. Ethan jolts. Leon's arm snaps away, the sleeve sliding to cover it. The old man's voice, low and rough, says, "Thank you, son. Now go on your way." But Ethan does not move. In his mind, the world shifts. That number lingers. It is not common, not decorative, not something one sees on a homeless man. It feels like weight, a hidden story, a wound. But what? In school that day, Ethan stares out the window. He tries to focus on math problems, but his mind returns to the number. He imagines reasons, scenarios, possibilities. And he knows that one day he will have to ask. If this story touches you, as it touched me writing it, leave a like, subscribe, and share. The stories that unravel the hidden wounds of history need witnesses. And now, get ready. What comes next will change what you thought you knew. His name was Leon Matthews, though almost no one ever used it. Not out loud, not with recognition, not with familiarity. Because to most people in that aging Ohio neighborhood, he was just the old guy with the cart. A quiet figure in layers of mismatched coats, pushing a rattling metal frame through alleys and along the backsides of buildings, collecting the things others no longer wanted, and navigating the city not by streets or signs, but by instinct, by memory, by need. Each morning, while the sky was still a pale, unfinished blue and street lamps flickered their last tired light, he moved without hurry, but with purpose, his steps slow but consistent, his hands gloved in frayed wool, gripping the cold steel handle of his cart like it was the only thing in the world that still made sense to him. And perhaps it was. Children whispered stories about him, as children do. Some said he was mute, some said he had no home, others claimed he had once been a teacher or a soldier or a prisoner, but none of them truly knew. And most, like the adults around them, looked away when he passed, avoiding his gaze, avoiding the questions that surfaced when they saw someone so thoroughly forgotten by the world. But Ethan, a 12-year-old boy who lived in a modest row house on Monroe Avenue and walked the same sidewalk to school every weekday morning, didn't look away. In fact, he started looking for Leon deliberately. Not at first because he was curious, but because something about the way the man moved, the way he pushed his cart with quiet resolve, suggested a kind of rhythm that Ethan recognized deep inside himself, even if he couldn't explain it. There was something different about Leon, something unspoken, something Ethan couldn't name, a weight, maybe, or a silence that felt thicker than just loneliness. It was the kind of silence that only comes from knowing things that can't easily be told. Then one particularly cold October morning, when the wind came sharp off the lake and the leaves skittered across the sidewalks like startled mice, Ethan saw Leon struggling near the corner where the bakery used to be, trying to lift a split garbage sack back onto his overloaded cart as glass bottles rolled onto the pavement and the cart tilted dangerously toward the curb. Without thinking, without fear or hesitation, Ethan ran forward, dropped his backpack, and crouched down to help. He didn't say much, just offered a quiet, "Here, let me," as he began picking up bottles and tucking them carefully into the crate, working beside the old man in the breath-fogged silence of early morning, both of them focused on the task in front of them, until Ethan reached for the final bottle, and as Leon leaned forward, his coat sleeve slipped back just enough for Ethan to see it. A number, tattooed on the man's inner wrist, not freshly inked, not decorative, not chosen, but faded, slightly blurred, and embedded so deeply into the skin that it seemed less like a mark and more like a scar made of memory, made of survival, made of something far older and heavier than either of them could put into words in that moment. Ethan froze. The number, black, cold, strangely rigid, sat on that weathered wrist like a whisper from another century. And though he had never seen anything quite like it before, something in his chest tightened with the understanding that this was not a random tattoo. This was a story. Leon saw the boy's eyes fix on the number. Quickly, without anger, but with the reflex of someone who had done it 1,000 times, he pulled his sleeve back down, covering the mark with practiced ease, then looked Ethan in the eye, not with fear, not even with shame, but with a kind of tired calm that said, plainly, "You saw it, didn't you?" "Thank you," Leon said quietly, his voice rough but not unkind. "You didn't have to help, but you did." Ethan opened his mouth, unsure of what to say, unsure if he should ask, but then simply nodded, gathered his backpack, and walked away, feeling the air around him change, feeling something invisible settle on his shoulders that he didn't yet have words for. Over the next few days, Ethan began leaving home a little earlier. Sometimes he brought Leon a cup of hot tea in a chipped travel mug. Other times, he simply walked beside the cart for a block or two, listening to the sound of its wheels on the cracked concrete, never asking about the number, never pushing for answers, just showing up. And in return, Leon began to nod when he saw him, began to offer a seat on the bench outside the abandoned gas station, began to speak, not about the past, not yet, but about the cold, about the changing wind, about how some things seem to blow through a city and stay longer than they should. And all the while, Ethan remembered that number. He couldn't forget it. He found himself sketching it from memory onto scraps of paper, circling the digits, wondering what they meant. Eventually, he began searching through library books, reading about things he barely understood: war, Europe, camps with names like ghosts. And slowly, piece by piece, the shape of something terrible and real began to form in his mind. He didn't bring it up, not right away. But one morning, as they sat on the bench sharing silence, Ethan turned and asked, without ceremony, without expectation, "Was that number from a place called Auschwitz?" And Leon, who had survived more than he had ever spoken, who had walked for decades unseen, simply nodded, looked down at his covered wrist and said, "It was where they gave me a number, because they didn't want to give me a grave." And in that instant, a boy became a witness. And a man who had once been erased was remembered, not by history, not by books, but by a child who had chosen to ask. The next time Ethan saw Leon, the sky was grey and heavy, like a sheet of steel stretched across the rooftops of Cleveland's South End, and the cold had a different kind of sharpness, not just the kind that bites at fingers and ears, but the kind that reminds you time is passing, seasons are changing, and some memories never fade, no matter how many years lie between then and now. They didn't speak right away. Leon was sitting on the usual bench, the one beside the old corner gas station that hadn't sold fuel in decades, holding a small metal thermos in both hands, warming his fingers as if the motion was more ritual than necessity. Ethan approached slowly, not wanting to disturb whatever thoughts were keeping Leon company, but the old man looked up, met his eyes, and gave the smallest of nods. An invitation not just to sit, but perhaps this time to listen. After a while, Leon reached into the pocket of his coat and pulled out a tin container, not larger than a sandwich box, dented, scratched, with a faded label that had long since lost its words. He placed it between them on the bench and rested his hands on his knees. "This box," he said quietly, "has gone more places than most people ever do. It's seen borders fall, trains that never came back, names that didn't survive long enough to be carved in stone." Ethan looked at it, not as a container, but as something sacred, and didn't speak. Leon opened the lid. Inside were a few photographs, edges curled from time and weather. A button, a page torn from a German children's book, a name badge with the ink all but vanished. A square of cloth, once white, now a dull grey, with a faint six-pointed star outlined in blue stitching, and then at the bottom a photo. Two boys, arms around each other, standing in a doorway, one older, one younger. Both skinny, both smiling. The older one looked like a younger Leon. The younger boy had the kind of face that stuck in the heart, wide eyes, soft mouth, unsure and full of trust. "This was my brother," Leon said, pointing to the smaller boy. "His name was Jacob. He was 9 when they took us." Ethan glanced up, unsure what to say. Leon didn't expect words. He continued. "They came in the spring, 1943. Lodz, Poland. I was 13. My father worked in a tannery. My mother taught reading to the neighborhood kids. We had a small apartment, 2 rooms, noisy neighbors. We had bread sometimes, soup when we were lucky. Then one day, the trucks came." He took a breath, as if the next part required strength he hadn't used in years. "They said we were going to work. We packed quickly, took food, clothing, pictures. My father said to act calm, to smile. He said, 'We'll be fine if we follow the rules.' But when we arrived, they took everything. Our names, our things, even our hair." He paused again. "They gave us numbers." He rolled up his sleeve with care. The number was still there, 76438, faded but sharp, like a whisper carved in stone. "That's what they did to me. That number became my name. That's how they called me. That's how I was counted. That's how I was forgotten." He lowered his arm. Ethan stared. He didn't ask questions. He didn't need to. The answers were all in the silence between Leon's words. "My brother," Leon continued, voice soft, "didn't last long. He was small. He got sick early. It was cold. He cried at night. I wasn't allowed to go near his barracks. I never saw him again after the second week. But before they moved him, he gave me something. A torn drawing he made of our apartment back home, the window, the dog downstairs, the radio we weren't supposed to touch. He told me to survive, to remember." Leon reached back into the tin and pulled out a tiny folded piece of paper. It was yellowed, torn, but still held the trace of a pencil sketch, crude lines, a box with a square window, a stick figure holding a balloon. "That's all I had of him. That's what kept me alive." For a long time, neither of them moved. Then Leon looked over at Ethan and said, "You asked if that number was my lucky number, but no. It wasn't luck. It was loss. It was silence. It was identity erased. And the only reason it means anything now is because someone, you, saw it and didn't turn away." Ethan nodded, his throat tight. Leon closed the box and rested it back in his lap. "I never wanted to tell anyone. I thought, what's the point? The world already forgot. But then you saw, and that changed everything." And in that moment, Ethan understood that witnessing, truly witnessing, wasn't about knowing all the facts or asking all the questions. It was about being present, about seeing what others refused to see, about giving a name back to someone who had been reduced to a number. After that day on the bench, when Leon opened the tin box and let Ethan see the ghosts he had carried for decades, in rusted metal and creased photographs, something in the space between them shifted, not in a loud or sudden way, but in a quiet, unmistakable current, like the soft turning of a tide. Leon didn't need to explain further. Ethan didn't need to ask. Yet what passed between them now was more than memory. It was weight, it was trust, it was legacy. But something in Ethan couldn't stay silent anymore. He tried at first. He tried to carry what Leon had given him as a private responsibility, something sacred, something too heavy to speak of out loud. But the more he tried to hold it in, the more it stirred inside him, asking to be shared. Not for spectacle, not for attention, but because some truths, once seen, asked to be witnessed again, by others. And so, one afternoon after school, when his teacher, Ms. Holloway, a soft-spoken woman who wore long skirts and kept a photo of Anne Frank taped to the side of her desk, asked him to stay behind to talk about his falling homework grades, he found himself saying something he hadn't planned to say. "I know someone," Ethan said, his voice low, unsure. "He's older. He used to live somewhere else, a long time ago. He has a number on his wrist. I think it was from one of those camps, from the war." Ms. Holloway looked at him for a long moment, not with shock, not with pity, but with the kind of solemn attentiveness that only comes from someone who understands history not as chapters in a textbook, but as real events carried in real people. She nodded. She asked careful questions. Ethan answered what he could. By the time the bell rang for after-school buses, she had already spoken to the school counselor and the principal, and by the next morning, she had called someone from the local Holocaust Education Foundation, a small organization that worked with survivors, collecting stories, preserving testimonies, and, when possible, helping them speak to young people who had never known a world without electricity, freedom, or safety. When they asked if Leon would be willing to speak, he said no, not out of fear, but because he believed, truly, deeply, that no one would care. "I'm not important," he said to Ethan when the boy brought him the request. "There are others who suffered more, others who were smarter, braver. I don't have anything worth saying." But Ethan shook his head. "You do. You're the first person who ever made me stop and really see. You don't have to tell everyone, but you already told me, and I think that means you can do it again." Leon didn't respond right away, but later that week, he asked Ethan to walk with him to the edge of the neighborhood, to the old community center near the train tracks. It was the first time Leon had been inside a public building in years. The center director offered him tea. The staff set up a tape recorder and a microphone just in case. There were no cameras, no crowds, just Leon, Ethan, and a historian named Dr. Rachel Mendez, who had spent most of her adult life recording the stories of those who once had been silenced. Leon didn't prepare notes. He didn't rehearse. He just began. He spoke slowly, haltingly, his voice dry and thick like pages of a book left too long in a forgotten library. He told them about Lodz, about the men in boots, about his brother Jakob and the drawing folded in the tin box. He talked about hunger, about numbers shouted in languages he never learned, about how silence can be a form of survival, and how it can also become a prison. He didn't cry. He didn't raise his voice. But when he finished, the room was still in a way that felt holy. Later, Dr. Mendez asked if he'd be willing to speak at a school. Leon hesitated. Then Ethan, who had been sitting quietly through it all, just as he had on the bench days before, looked up and said, "If you speak, someone like me might be sitting in the room, someone who never knew this happened, someone who's waiting for the truth." And so, 2 weeks later, Leon stood in front of 50 eighth graders in a small auditorium, wearing the same coat he always wore, with his sleeves rolled down, holding nothing but a folded piece of paper in his hand. He didn't read from it. He just held it, maybe for comfort, maybe as an anchor. He said, "My name is Leon Matthews. A long time ago, they gave me the number 76438. But before that, I had a name, a home, a family, a brother. And now, thanks to one boy who saw me, I have my name again." He rolled up his sleeve, slowly. Some of the students gasped. Others simply stared. And in the silence that followed, something broke open. Not in Leon, but in the room. A kind of understanding, a shared breath, a ripple of truth. They applauded, not loudly, not with whistles or shouts, but with the kind of solemn respect usually reserved for things people don't know how to describe. And afterward, students came forward. Some shook his hand, some just whispered thank you. But Ethan, he didn't say anything at all. He just stood beside Leon, and that was enough. In the days following Leon's talk at the school auditorium, a moment that had begun with trembling hands and a voice unsure whether anyone still cared about what had happened more than 30 years before, something began to shift in ways no one, not even Leon himself, could have predicted. The silence that had for so long defined his presence in the city, that had allowed him to pass through streets unnoticed, unseen, unspoken to, began to dissolve, not in fanfare, not in some overnight transformation, but in quiet moments that built upon each other like bricks laid carefully along a new path. It started with a photograph. One of the teachers, a part-time photographer who volunteered for the local paper, had captured a simple image during Leon's talk. A man standing alone on stage, a long coat hanging from thin shoulders, a sleeve rolled up just enough to reveal the faded numbers on his arm, and in the front row, just out of focus, the face of a boy, Ethan, looking up not at the number, but at the man. The image was published in the community section of the Sunday edition with the headline, "Survivor Breaks His Silence and a Generation Listens." By Monday morning, something was different. At the bakery Leon passed every morning, the young woman behind the counter offered him coffee, not in silence, not with pity, but with eye contact and a soft, "Thank you for sharing your story." At the hardware store where he sometimes sold scrap metal, the clerk rounded up his change and said, "You're Leon, right? My grandfather was in the war. I read about you." People no longer looked through him. They saw him, not as the man with the cart, but as Leon Matthews, a man with a name, a history, a presence. The city hadn't changed, but how the city looked at him had. And Leon, though cautious at first, began to receive it. Not with pride, not as someone who had longed for recognition, but with a quiet sort of peace, the kind that comes not from being honored, but from being acknowledged. Ethan remained at his side, not as a reporter, not as a student fulfilling a project, but as a boy who had once stopped to ask a question and who had since chosen, day after day, to keep showing up. On weekends, they walked together, pushing Leon's cart along the back alleys of the city, collecting glass bottles and folded cardboard, not because Leon still needed to, but because it gave his days rhythm, because it grounded him in motion, in routine, in purpose. And somewhere along the way, it became more than habit. It became ritual. One morning, as they sat on the same bench where Ethan had first asked about Auschwitz, the boy took out a black marker and, without asking, gently took Leon's wrist in his hand and wrote 3 letters beside the tattooed number, ETH. Leon looked down, then looked at the boy, who simply said, "So you're not just a number anymore." And Leon smiled, not the tight, practiced smile of a man avoiding conversation, but the soft, inward smile of someone who has finally been heard. "That's the first time I've ever liked something on this arm," he said. From that point on, whenever someone asked him why he had finally decided to tell his story, he never mentioned the newspaper article, the school assembly, or the community response. He simply said, "Because a boy asked me a question, and I realized I was still alive." Later that spring, Leon was invited to participate in a national oral history project, one aimed at preserving the voices of Holocaust survivors for future generations. The team came from New York, with cameras, sound equipment, translators, and notebooks. They expected to work with someone who needed direction, structure, guidance. What they found was a man who already knew what he needed to say. Leon sat in front of the camera, his old coat folded neatly over the back of the chair, and began. "My name is Leon Matthews. They tried to make me forget that, but I didn't. And because one boy saw me when no one else did, I'm going to make sure the world remembers too." That interview was archived, translated, uploaded to a national database, and shown at educational programs across the country. Thousands of students would one day hear Leon's voice, not as a history lesson, but as a human voice breaking through time. But Leon didn't talk about any of that. He still pushed his cart, still walked the same streets, still sat on the same bench. But now, people waved. Children greeted him. Strangers thanked him. And in the soft hours before dawn, when the sky was still dark and the world still quiet, Leon no longer walked through the city as a ghost. He walked as someone remembered, not because of headlines, not because of institutions, but because one boy looked up from the sidewalk, saw a man pushing a cart, saw a number on his wrist, and chose not to look away. Leon never stopped walking the city at dawn. Even after the assemblies ended, after the camera crews packed up their cables and the newspaper stories were folded into scrapbooks or lined bird cages, he still rose before sunrise, still layered on his threadbare coats, still gripped the handle of his cart with gloved hands and pushed it down quiet alleys that hadn't changed in years. But something had changed. Not in the pavement, not in the buildings, not in the cold that clung to the early morning hours, but in the space between his steps and the world around him. Where once he was met with avoidance, now there were greetings. Where once he passed unnoticed, now came nods of acknowledgement, smiles that lingered, names remembered. And though Leon never sought that change, he carried it with grace. He still said little, still preferred the rhythm of silence to the noise of crowds, but every now and then, at the corner bakery, outside the school gates, in the small park where Ethan sometimes waited with 2 steaming cups of coffee, someone would ask about the number on his arm, and if the moment felt right, he would answer, not with lectures, not with bitterness, but with memory, carefully measured, gently offered, the way one might pass a delicate photograph from hand to hand, hoping it would not be dropped or dismissed. Ethan kept walking with him. The seasons changed. Winter thawed, summer came, leaves turned and fell, but the boy never stopped showing up. And Leon, who had once believed that survival meant staying silent, began to understand that true survival, real, lasting survival, meant being remembered, not for the suffering, but for the enduring, not for the number, but for the name. One morning, just as the light began to spread across the rooftops in pale gold ribbons, they sat on the bench again, side by side, no words needed. Ethan took a pen from his pocket, gently reached for Leon's arm, and redrew the faded letters he had written months earlier. Eth, still there, still beside the number. Leon looked down, smiled, and said, "You know, I used to walk these streets thinking I was the last echo of something no one wanted to hear, but now I know, if someone like you is listening, maybe the echo becomes a voice again." And Ethan, his voice steady, said, "You were never an echo, you were just waiting for someone to answer." Leon nodded, and in that small, quiet moment, with the city still waking and the world still holding its breath between one day and the next, the man who had once walked in darkness knew the night was no longer dark. It had been lit by a question, by a boy's voice, by a name written beside a number. And perhaps, just perhaps, that was enough to keep the light alive. We share new stories every day, true accounts that move, inspire, and remind us what matters. If this story resonated with you, share it, comment below, and help us keep these voices alive.